We have another terrific show for you today and an amazing guest. Welcome to the Tech and Space Leader Show, where we learn lessons from leaders of the next frontier. I am your host, Lisa Dreher, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest for today, Carlos Placido. He is a leading Satcom consultant and advisor. Welcome to the show, Carlos.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks a lot for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being here. Maybe we can start by having you give a little bit of background on yourself and the consulting services that you offer.
Sure. So I'm, Carlos Placido, an independent consultant, as you mentioned, and I've been in the satellite business for like 30 plus years now, working across the sector from satellite operators like Intelsat to service providers, telecom operators, and over the last, I would say, 20 years, I've been working as an independent consultant and an analyst, supporting clients directly and also through major global consulting firms like NSR, which is now part of Analysis Mason. And so I mean, consultants do not have two projects equal, right? So it's hard to like say precisely what you do, but my business has been primarily, on the techno and the strategy side of the business, more like trends and opportunities, things like that. That's my core area.
Excellent, excellent. So you also were very involved in the development of the Non-GEO Constellations Analysis Toolkit, or NCAT. Is that how you say it? And do you say NCAT? Yeah.
That's right.
And can you maybe briefly explain what that is and how that kind of came about? I think that came about through NSR, that's now part of Analysis Mason, correct?
That's correct. Yes. I mean, the way it was developed, it was like, I would say maybe like 10 years ago, we were working on consulting projects about potentially available in the future back then, broadband constellations, although back then O3 was already up and running. But when it comes to LEO constellations, there were no constellations in space yet. But we were already working on projects, and we actually realized we needed to develop tools for ourselves because we didn't have the way to assess and benchmark constellations through then traditional, geostationary lenses. It's a very different business in terms of dynamics, how the technical business economics works. So we initially developed tools for ourselves, and then during the pandemic, back in 2020, we decided to productize it as NCAT 1. Now we have a fully cloud-based toolkit, NCAT 6, and what it is it is an analytics platform that allows users to benchmark and assess constellations from different angles, both market, technical, as well as business and even strategic. So that's what it is.
Wow. Okay. So as you went through all of the versions and now version 6, it sounds like that's what you're on. What have been the most, I guess, exciting new features that have been added?
Well, I mean, we are obviously piggybacking on the AI trend. So we launched an AI agent that allows users to extract insights, to interpret insights, even write reports for them. And the good news, the interesting thing about that is that when you combine large language models, in our case, we use Google Gemini, with deterministic analytics, that's very powerful because there are no hallucinations, and it allows any user to interpret findings that otherwise would be very difficult because some of the calculations are very, engineering driven, if you will. So that's one of the things. We also recently, with NCAT 6.1, we launched application programming interfaces so that users could embed NCAT analytics and data sets into their own workflows and business logic, kind of, becoming more like a platform or an operating system for others to.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, so how has that changed the way that operators or investors might evaluate the LEO systems?
Well, I mean, with NCAT, the good thing about NCAT is that it allows, as you mentioned, investors, strategies, for example, to run technical calculations without understanding all the background calculations that are going on, right? It's almost like driving a car without understanding necessarily understanding the mechanics of a car.
Right.
So that makes it very easy for anyone to run very accurate and factual analysis that would otherwise maybe require weeks of work with other teams, right? Running on other tools. It's being a web-based application from the user's point of view. It's very easy to interface with and to extract insights from.
Right, right, right. So I guess beyond Starlink that, everybody knows about that, are there a couple of emerging constellations, LEO constellations that are perhaps showing up as surprisingly competitive through using the NCAT analysis?
Well, NCAT allows you to essentially, benchmark and analyze any constellations, both current and future. I would say that the other, I mean, obviously outside, SpaceX and Amazon, you have, well-established operators that are making a very good transition towards non-GEO, SES being a prime example. In fact, SES with O3b was the very first non-GEO broadband constellation back in 2013, I think. So from that point of view, they have, and it's interesting when it comes to MEO because the dynamics of MEO is that as you have more MEO, you don't need many satellites to have continuous service, unlike LEOs where you need a lot. And then as you have more satellites, you can get into a very interesting virtual cycle with, better look angles and better addressability, etc. So I'm still bullish on MEO, but every orbit has its place, as they say. So it's not like one or the other. But that would be one. Obviously, Viasat is another major player. It's not an emerging one. They've been around for a long time. And it's interesting what they are trying to do with regards to coming up with a kind of, coalition of players, each one kind of, coming with their own MSS spectrum for a direct-to-device global, ecosystem, which is, I think that's a key area of focus. Ecosystems, that should be a key area of focus for these
Right, right.
others, AST and others that are also online.
How does the analysis work across orbits? So it sounds like it's not just LEO, but also MEO.
That's correct. You have LEO, MEO, and GEO. I mean, depending on the altitude, essentially. For a long time, when it comes to communications, GEO was the only orbit. It was a geostationary equatorial orbit, meaning that it had satellites, around the equator, 37,000 kilometers away, which higher latency, but also simplicity, right? Because those orbits have the characteristic that they rotate at the same speed as Earth, so they appear stationary, and that's why they're called geostationary. MEO so far has been equatorial MEO, excuse me, but SES, for example, with the M-sphere, they will get, which is the next generation MEO system, they also get into inclined orbits so that they can also cover the poles. And LEO and VLEO, even very low Earth orbit, which is what you see today with, for example, Starlink mobile satellites. Those are orbiting at similar altitude as the International Space Station, 400 kilometers, 300 kilometers. And the problem with that is that the lower you are in altitude, the more satellites you need for a continuous service. You have those trade-offs in satellites that are very interesting, I would say.
Right, right, right. For a commercial entity that is considering a major investment in a new satellite system, how does the NCAT analysis tool help them, I guess, de-risk that?
Oh, well, by essentially assessing constellations factually, that's the best way to the risk, right? Because as I said before, analyzing constellations uh, it's not simple. It's not that you can do it statically. You actually need to simulate the constellation as satellites move around, how many satellites you see, what's the distribution of demand versus the feasible supply, and that's all very dynamic because it also depends on the neighboring areas. It's very dynamic. So the only way to do that is to do it right, essentially. And if you can do it right and do it easily, that is the way to de-risk and make decisions faster and more confidently. So,
Sure.
so that's key. And not only for investment, also for partnering, like telcos that need to partner with satellite operators or invest in satellite operators, like what you've seen with AST. Many telcos have invested into AST. It's
Right,
key to
right.
understand, how these things work And you don't need to understand the technical level because it's all, although NCAD is all, it's bottom up. Uh, at the end of the day, all the business is driven by the technical analysis behind the scenes.
Right, right, right. What role do new regulatory regulations? What role do new regulations, I guess, play in all of this? And is that part of the analysis?
Well, NCAD does have, for example, analysis with regards to ITU Article 22, which has to do with exclusion angles for LEOs not to interfere with GEOs. The LEO to LEO interference, I think, is more like currently conducted on a case-by-case basis. There is, as far as I know, there is no like an ITU umbrella that dictates that, although that should be there, as you mentioned, regulatory-wise in the future. And yeah, I think the regulatory, like in any industry that is moving so fast, the regulatory landscape has to do some catch up, right? And it's not just about a global, but also locally for direct to device. You may have like a country with different rules than other countries, like the UK has different power flux density limits than the US, for example, for direct to device. So it's very dynamic now, but yeah, there's a lot of work to do with regards to regulation, both on the collision avoidance front, as well as interference avoidance.
Of course, of course. On that kind of international perspective, what are some of your general views on just the idea of sovereign Leo constellations, and what challenges, I guess, did you see countries facing as they consider the rollout of their own Leo or VLEO constellations?
Well, I guess the main problem with LEO or VLEO is that you need to be a global player regardless of what areas you're focused on. Unlike GEOs, where you could have a satellite covering a region or a country fully, with LEOs and even more so with VLEOs, you need hundreds, if not thousands, of satellites, regardless of what areas you're focused on. So that's the main challenge, because even if you have a rich country that is willing to deploy a global constellation, to make it sustainable, you need to open up markets pretty much globally. So
Yeah.
at the end of the day, that's the reason why you need. I mean, these mega constellations are driven by major, space powers like the U.S., China, European Union. But outside that, you need to come up with a different model. And as I mentioned before, an ecosystem-driven model where perhaps you have a coalition of countries, coming together to come up with their own system makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. You mentioned direct to device or D2D earlier in our conversation. What do you see, I guess, as the role of all of this and what's happening with the kind of major players in this space? And how does that all play out in terms of MSS spectrum acquisition?
Well, I mean, direct to device, as you know, is a very hot, application these days. The potential is huge, but it has a lot of technical challenges. It's a very technically challenging application. So, I mean, hats off to all those, smart engineers working on it, because they are actually, it's almost like magic. But
Yes.
it's interesting because, I mean, let's put it, let's step back a bit. Direct to device has been around for 30 years. I mean, companies like Iridium, Global Star, which is now part of Amazon, they've been around for a long time. But the thing is that now the idea is to connect to unmodified devices like smartphones, right? Which have a very weak, signal, isotropic antenna. So connecting that to satellite is a major technical issue. And what started off as an alternative to connect users in areas where there is no cell towers nearby, using mobile operator spectrum, interesting enough, now it's coming full circle to MSS band, as you mentioned again. So it's like the bands that Iridium and Global Star have been using are now very attractive, right, to the AST Space Mobiles, the Amazons and SpaceX of the world, and the Viasats, to say, okay, now we can use a globally harmonized spectrum that we don't risk, interfering with cell towers, right? So
Yeah.
that's so you see kind of a convergence between MSS driven direct device and MSS direct device. The problem with MSS though is that many devices do not yet support MSS.
Yeah.
So device manufacturing has to catch up with that, but that's the direction things are taking. And you see now with, for example, with the acquisition of Amazon of Globalstar, I'm sure there is some kind of agreement with Apple, right? That was actually an investor in Globalstar to fully support these bands or additional bands that Amazon may add to the constellation in the future. There's
Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah.
conversions going on, I would say.
True, true. Yeah, I was fortunate to be able to participate in the T-Mobile beta test of the satellite direct-to-device, and well, honestly, it was kind of hit or miss. So yeah, we'll see how that all develops.
Yeah, because back then there were not as many satellites. As they put on more satellites up there, obviously the coverage per system goes up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was just a little bit less than a year ago. So yeah,
Oh,
it'll
okay. It
be
was
it'll
still.
be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see how it all evolves over time.
Definitely.
So, what do you think of orbital data centers? This is big in the
Oh.
news right now. Everybody's talking about it. What do you think?
Well, I'm not an expert on that. I mean, but I mean, from what I'm seeing and from what I'm hearing, yeah, it's obviously very interesting. I'm not sure if it's going to be a replacement of, regular data centers on Earth, but there might be interesting sweet spots. I have a colleague called Claude Russo who recently was talking about this. He had a very interesting point. He said the initial killer app for orbital data centers may be actually serving the space market, right? Because there is a lot of analytics of space imagery and sensors, etc., that makes a lot of sense to do in space. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, I mean, in the case of SpaceX, it's part of the story, right? That they're building towards the IPO, but at the same time, there is some very interesting aspects about solar power being out there all the time. But it's very challenging too because I mean these GPUs process a lot of data but also consume a lot of power. They need to dissipate a lot of heat, which is difficult in space. So we'll see. I think that we should see in the first steps. This is definitely going to happen, but the scale of this will, regardless of how many satellites they file, that's yes yet I think to be seen.
Yeah, sure, sure, sure. What do you see as the long-term sustainability, I guess, challenges and risks in LEO and VLEO?
Well, I mean, you can look at it from two perspectives. One is from the collision avoidance perspective, right? You might have heard about the Kessler's syndrome, right? Potentially this chain reaction of collisions.
Yeah,
That as you have more satellites, they are more likely to happen, and also obviously the interference avoidance aspect. With regards to collisions, I mean, I always give the same story here. Is that I mean, there is a lot of space in space. And now currently you have like roughly 15,000 satellites orbiting Earth. And I always give this comparison of cars. I mean, you have 1.5 billion cars, right? So you have 100,000 less, or 100,000 times less, satellites in space than cars on Earth. And cars are far more concentrated. They are all at the ground level, whereas in
yeah,
space you have all this. So there is a lot of space. However, obviously space it's not apples to apples because space is challenging. You need to make maneuvers ahead of time. They are moving very fast, right? But I get the sense that we'll figure this out. That there is a lot of room to grow in space. At some point, certain altitudes might be challenging, depending on densification. But
yeah.
I get the sense that you might actually get some issues with interference avoidance before we get into collisions avoidance bottlenecks.
Ah, very interesting perspective. I love that analogy because that really does kind of put it into perspective for us. So, if someone wanted to connect with you or learn more about your services, what should they do?
Well, they can just look me up in LinkedIn. That's where I'm most active. I also have an X account, but I'm not using it that much. I found LinkedIn to be far more useful, especially if you need to, share your ideas in more than 140 characters. So,
Yes, indeed, indeed. Well, yes, and I highly encourage everyone to follow Carlos on LinkedIn. He's always posting really insightful information. Thank you so much for making time to be here today. We really appreciate it, Carlos.
thanks a lot, Lisa. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Absolutely. And I do want to take a moment to thank GuideForce for hosting these sessions. To learn more about GuideForce, you can visit GuideForce at guideforce.com. And we'll see you next time on the Tech and Space Leader Show.